Having Assad just basically blown away by a bunch of relatively poorly armed rebels shows that the king is not wearing any clothes. That Putin really isn't the tough guy that can come in and save his pal, his friend Assad, when the going gets tough.
First of all, you are normally introduced as one of the archest of all Vladimir Putin's critics. For people who don't know enough about you, perhaps don't know as much as they should, how have you achieved that title? What's your definition of why you are called one of his archest critics?
So I was once living in Russia and running the largest foreign investment fund in Russia. I uncovered massive corruption in the companies I was investing in. I exposed that corruption. In retaliation, I was expelled from the country. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was then arrested, tortured, and killed in Russian police custody. And after his murder, I went on a mission to get justice, which led to something called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act freezes the assets and bans the travel of human rights violators and kleptocrats in Russia. The Magnitsky Act was passed in the United States in 2012, in the UK in 2018, and now exists in 35 countries around the world. And since Vladimir Putin is a human rights violator and a kleptocrat, and he keeps a lot of his money abroad, I put his whole fortune at risk. And so he hates my guts because his entire kleptocratic business model has been disrupted by this legislation that I was responsible for.
He does hate your guts. I know you've been asked this before, but I've got to ask it again. Are you safe?
I don't believe that when Putin hates your guts, you're safe by any means. I try to take as many precautions as I can. And so far, I've survived. A lot of my friends and allies in this fight have not. As I mentioned, my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was killed. My friend Boris Nemtsov, who helped me lobby for the Magnitsky Act, was killed. My friend Alexei Navalny, who was a great partner in our anti-corruption fights, was killed. And that's not to mention many, many others. It's a dangerous, dangerous business to cross Vladimir Putin. He's a mafia boss. He's a murderer. He's a serial killer, really. And so I just have to do whatever I can to try to stay safe. And I don't have a particularly normal life compared to everybody else.
This hasn't been a great couple of weeks for Vladimir Putin or for his regime. With the fall of Assad, are we completely wrong to be mildly optimistic about the chances of him being toppled, possibly even quite soon?
Well, I think that may be an over-optimistic projection. I think we can say that the bad guys in the world have had a bad week. I don't think these bad guys like Vladimir Putin can have bad weeks or bad months or even bad years, and they bounce back. And you remember after Putin invaded Crimea and he went to the G20 meeting, he sat by himself at lunch because he was shunned by every world leader, and we all thought that's the total isolation of Vladimir Putin. And then somehow he was able to sort of worm his way back into the good graces of at least some world leaders. And so I think that this is a very significant development, what happened with Assad, because Assad was Putin's man in Syria. And Putin had made the representation that he would do whatever he had to do to keep Assad in place. And for 13 years, that worked. But then, we ended up with this situation which completely, blew out of control for Assad and for Putin. And this has two really important significant elements. The first is that what it shows is that Putin is materially stretched, that his war in Ukraine doesn't allow him to support his dictator friends, his client states in other countries, and that's significant. But the second thing, and I think this is even much more significant, is that Putin's entire model of dictatorship is to thump his chest, make all sorts of nasty threats all around the world, and look like a tough guy. And having Assad just basically blown away by a bunch of relatively poorly armed rebels shows that the king is not wearing any clothes. That Putin really isn't the tough guy that can come in and save his pal, his friend Assad, when the going gets tough. And if Putin doesn't look like a tough guy, then he's got a lot of other problems at home. And so, possibly, maybe this inspires people who want to stand up to Putin to stand up to him. I don't know, but I think that the most important thing is that he's been shown to be the king not wearing any clothes.
What will the average Russian citizen know about what's happened in Syria and the part that Putin's regime played, or as it turned out, didn't play in it?
Well, I think that the average Russian citizen will see a very kind of rose-colored glasses view of what happened. I don't think that Russian state television can say nothing happened, but they can blame it on terrorists, they can blame it on other countries, they can blame it on the West. They tend to take all their failures and find a way to spin it so that the average Russian person doesn't think any less of Putin. But it's not the average Russian person that he needs to worry about. He needs to worry about the generals or some other person that he wants to have a go at him, and he also needs to worry about the Ukrainians who are perhaps emboldened by this whole thing, and he also has to worry about what it looks like for the incoming White House. How does Trump view this situation in Syria? Does it make him look weaker? Does it make him look like somebody that Trump doesn't have to make concessions to?
Well,
And so,
Trump was in Notre Dame over the weekend at that wonderful ceremony, and the acclaim, the applause that Zelensky got, Trump will have seen that. He'll have heard it. He'll have felt it. Is he going to be just reassessing his view of how to bring about an end to the Ukraine-Russia war?
well, you're making a big assumption that Trump actually has a view going into this. I think that he probably will develop his view 30 minutes before he goes into whatever negotiating room there is with Zelensky and Putin. I don't think that Trump has a strong view. He has slogans. He says, we're going to end this war in 24 hours. We're going to make a deal, all that kind of stuff. But I don't think he has a view on how to really resolve this, because it's a very complicated situation. If it was so easy to resolve, it would have already been resolved a long time ago. And so, Putin, I believe, is at war in Ukraine for one simple reason. He needs a war of distraction so that the Russian people aren't mad at him. They're mad at a foreign enemy. And Zelensky's at war because Russian troops are killing their citizens and raping their women and kidnapping their children. And neither side can back off. The Ukrainians can't back off and say, okay, you can just kill all of us. That's no problem. And Putin believes that if he backs off, he looks weak, and that someone's going to come and knock him out of power. And Putin doesn't have the same benefit that Assad has. There's no country in the world that will give safe harbor to Putin if he collapses, because the West will want him, and whatever subsequent regime in Russia will want him. And I don't think anyone wants to stand up to the West and to Russia in a post-Putin era. So Putin really views this as sort of a life and death situation. He's got to keep this war going in order to stay in power and stay alive.
But I mean, even in Ukraine, he's dependent on these North Korean troops, isn't he? I mean, that's another illustration of how, as you said earlier, he's being really, really stretched.
Well, I mean, so this is probably the most interesting thing. So since the beginning of this war, he has refused to call it a war. He calls it a special military operation. Why does he call it a special military operation? Because that gives the impression to the Russian people, this is some kind of like minor thing going on the periphery. It doesn't really involve you. You can root for us, but that you don't really need to be thinking all that carefully about it. It doesn't affect your life. And so for as a result, there's not huge public opinion against this, quote, special military operation. But in order to keep it as a special military operation, as opposed to a war in the minds of the people, he can't impose a general conscription of soldiers. And this has created a huge problem because, according to the Ukrainian estimates, the Russians have lost 750,000 soldiers since this whole thing started, either death or severe disability. And so he's lost the entire sort of fighting force he started with. And so how has he replaced those people? Well, first he went to the prisons and he said, any prisoner who wants to fight in Ukraine can get out. And so they emptied out all the prisons, and all the prisoners went to Ukraine, and most of them died. then he started going around the poorest regions of Russia and said to the people, we'll pay you money to come and be a contract soldier in Ukraine. And so a lot of poor people signed up, and then they were killed. And the most interesting thing is that they used to pay a bonus of $4,000 to get poor people to sign up to go and die in Ukraine. And now the price has gone up to $47,000. And so basically they've run out of people, run out of prisoners, run out of poor people that are ready to take the money. And they had to raise the money by more than 10 times. And so what do? They start, begging whoever they can to bring in more soldiers. And so now they're paying the North Koreans to send in their soldiers. Apparently there's Houthi soldiers in Russia. And as you said, that shows that this thing is not going well for Putin. And it's not just the soldier problem, but the economics are not going well in Russia. All these people who have died, all the people who have left, have created a huge shortage of workers. As a result, there's massive inflation. They have interest rates at 21%. Apparently, they're going to have to raise interest rates. The price of potatoes and butter has gone up by like 60%. And so for whatever impression Putin is trying to give that he's doing a great job and it's all going fine for him and we're the ones having problems. No, he's having some big problems as well, and all these things show it.
When the end comes for Putin, as it surely will, it will be somebody internal making a move. Now, there isn't exactly succession planning in a country like Russia. So have you any idea who that person or who those people might be?
Well, it really all depends on how Putin ends up losing power. If he dies in his sleep tonight, then the oligarchs and the security officials will all get together in the Kremlin and try to figure out how do we keep the whole Putin thing going, because there's so much money at stake. They've stolen such a large amount of money over such a long period of time that they would be afraid of having a sort of non-regime approved leader come in and take that money away from them. And so if he dies in his sleep, it's going to be sort of status quo. You could have a situation like we saw in June of 2023 when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, one of the most ruthless but effective military men, mercenaries, I should say, marched on Moscow. And that was a situation where it could have gone either way. The Russian people were not like standing in the way of Prigozhin's tanks ready to protect Vladimir Putin. The Russian people just wanted to know, who do they report to now? Or the third option is sort of the Syrian type of option, where the whole regime just collapses. All the Putin people get on their private jets and flee. A lot of them don't get out, and you have some kind of provisional government put together by the Russian opposition. That's
And
of course
you don't rule that out.
I don't rule it out. I think it's a low probability scenario, but it's a scenario for sure. It's not a zero probability scenario.
And the chances of a war between the West and Russia, do you think they're higher or lower than they were at the start of this year?
Well, I think every day that goes by, they become lower because Putin is running out of resources to fight a war. If he can't take on Ukraine, how is he going to take on the West? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. I don't think that China wants to come in and go to war with the United States and in European countries over Russia. I don't think that makes any sense. And so Putin is sitting there, running out of resources. He can't protect his client states. He can't even fight effectively against Ukraine, which is a much smaller, much less resourced country. How in the hell is he going to have a war with the West? I mean, he knows he'll lose that in a matter of moments.
And other parts of the Putin project have got into difficulty. Romania, Georgia. The Russian state has tried to intervene, and it would seem that they've been found out.
Indeed, completely. So, Romania is a great example that a totally unknown, massively pro-Russian candidate for the presidency of Romania showed up, and then with a total deluge on all social media channels, was with Russian money bombarding those social media channels, he ended up winning in the first round of the presidential elections. And all the evidence of the Russians' involvement came to light very quickly. And their Supreme Court did the right thing, which is to say, why should Russia determine the outcome of our elections? And they nullified that round of elections. In Moldova, the same thing happened. In this case, there was no Supreme Court decision that just the good guys beat the bad guys by like 51-49. We have a situation in Georgia right now. In Georgia, which Russia, by the way, invaded in 2008, um, and then annexed some part of the territory, and then put one of their own people in to run for president, a billionaire, to run for president. He won the presidency, and he then basically put his own people all over the place in government. And after the parliamentary elections a few weeks ago, Georgia then made an announcement to say that they're not going to be part of the European Union. They're going to cancel their joining plans. And what's happened? There's like hundreds of thousands of people on the street of Georgia protesting, very much like what we saw in Ukraine in 2014, the Maidan revolution, where the Ukrainian people, it's the exact same scenario where the Russian puppet at the time in Ukraine wanted to abandon the EU, sort of join up with Russia, and the people said enough is enough. We don't want anything to do with you, and they took over the square of Central Square, the Maidan Square, and he ended up fleeing to Russia like Assad did. We don't know what's going to happen in Georgia, but it could go the wrong way. And so whenever there's like something like what happened in Syria, it's not an isolated incident. It shows that there's stress in the system, and often these things lead to other dominoes falling, and where those dominoes fall and where we should be looking, it's often hard to say. I mean, who was to have known that Syria would fall? I mean, it was we were all looking left, and that happened to the right. And so I think we don't know what's going to happen next, but this is a very brittle time, and potentially, not a great time for Vladimir Putin.
Great. Well, let's hope it isn't a great time for Vladimir. Okay. So, Bill, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you.